Good morning. Good to be together this morning. Have a nice number with us, and I believe we have several mothers among us. And so happy Mother's Day to you. Hope that you are getting treated well today, but hope that it continues throughout your life as you do such an important work. And to that end, I want to talk about mothers today. When we think about mothers, today is a day where you might end up getting some flowers and all that stuff, but sometimes you might feel overlooked. Maybe that's your day-to-day where you feel overlooked in the work that you do and that you're not cared for like you should or appreciated like you should. That's probably, I'm sure, everyone has those seasons or those moments or chapters in life where they feel like being a mother is a thankless job, and unfortunately sometimes it is. But certainly not in the eyes of God. And so know that you are loved, that you are cared for, and to that end, that's what we're going to look at this morning. Because when we even come to the Bible and we think about, if I said, name some of the most influential people of the Bible, of course, Jesus is front and center, God the Father is front and center, the Spirit is front and center, and so aside from them and from God Himself, who else do we think about? Moses, Abraham, Joseph, David, Peter, Paul. Man, right? Sometimes it feels like it's dominated by men. Dig a little bit deeper. When you look at some other notable people of Scripture, you think of some notable women as well who get plenty of attention, like Ruth and Sarah and Ruth and Deborah and Esther. And some of them were mothers that were, and of course I know Ruth became a mother as well, but we think about Sarah and Hannah and Elizabeth and Mary. Mary gets front and center a lot with Mother's Day and with mothers in general. And so all of those are well and good. We need to observe their stories as well. But I want to actually look at 4 overlooked mothers in Scripture and maybe point out some of the day-to-day things that you do and maybe some of the things that nobody else knows about. Of course, God recognizes them, and we want to recognize just how blessed we are to have these influential people, these mothers in our lives. And so while this lesson is for mothers, and specifically for overlooked mothers, we're going to look at 4 mothers, and maybe you find yourself interwoven in those stories in some aspect. And so I hope that this will be a blessing to you to be able to think about the blessing of mothers. Of course, this crosses every spectrum of where we are, whether we are a father or a mother or have never had children or our children are out of the home. I think there are lessons for all of us in this. And if nothing else, maybe we walk away appreciating the job that our mothers did for us, or appreciating the job that the mother in our home is doing now, or what we aspire to be as mothers and certainly fathers as well. And so the first mother I want to look at is found in 2 Samuel. I'm going to guess that maybe you've never heard a lesson on Rizpah, right? Probably not been a name on your baby board either of names that you would name your child, but Rizpah is a mother that we find in Scripture. In 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 7, we read just this: Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why have you gone in to my father's concubine?" This was actually a false claim. This did not happen, but we read about Rizpah later on in 2 Samuel chapter 21. In 2 Samuel chapter 21 and in verse 1, excuse me. In 2 Samuel chapter 21 and verse 1, now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, "There is blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he put the Gibeonites to death." So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. And David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you, and how shall I make atonement that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?" The Gibeonites said to him, "It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house, neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel." And he said, "What do you say that I shall do for you?" They said to the king, "The man who consumed us and planned to destroy us, so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be given to us, so that we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord." And the king said, "I will give them." But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. The king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth. Pause. That's a different Mephibosheth than the one that was spared. It's just 2 of the same name. And the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Meolite. And he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the mountain before the Lord, and the 7 of them perished together. They were put to death in the first days of harvest, at the beginning of barley harvest. Then Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of harvest until rain fell upon them from the heavens. And she did not allow the birds of the air to come upon them day by day, or the beasts of the field by night. When David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them on the day the Philistines killed Saul on Gilboa. And he brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who were hanged. Well, happy Mother's Day, right? What a pleasant story. Not at all. It's a troubling story. It's one that you see some negotiations being had of trying to reconcile a broken relationship between nations. And so now Saul's kin, his children, 2 of which are from this woman Rizpah, are put to death. And we say, well, what is there to admire in this story at all? I think we can admire Rizpah herself. Her personal world was torn apart in the midst of a famine. You see there in the very first verse, for 3 years, year after year, there was a famine in the days of David. David was seeking the face of the Lord. God is telling him that he needs to, that there is blood guilt on Saul and his house because of the killing of the Gibeonites. And so David tries to reconcile this relationship. But here, blowing out in the wind, is Rizpah, who has her 2 sons taken from her. They are executed, and you can only imagine as a parent that she'd rather take their place. If she had the choice, I would guess for most of us that's the feeling that we would have. If this has to happen, I'd rather you take me instead of my children from that standpoint. That does not mean that these men were not guilty themselves, at very least maybe guilt by association, but she still found dignity worth seeking in the death of her sons. I think that's a point to be made here. We live in a culture now that is just so flippant about life and death. Now, if this child is wanted, then it's a life worth celebrating. And this person got to live their life to 70, 80, 90 years. Well, it's a life worth celebrating. And so we have caveats on what is life and what is really valuable and a legitimate pregnancy or what have you. And yet here on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, these men are gone. Their soul has left them. They are dead. And yet she still has dignity for them. You can compare that to the feuding mothers before Solomon there in 1 Kings chapter 3, 23 through 28. You remember the story, I'm sure, where these 2 women, they were prostitutes by trade, but we read that they both had babies and on the same day, and one killed her child by accident because she laid on top of him. And so she went and swiped the other baby and posed as though that was her child and put the dead baby by her, the other woman who did not accidentally kill her child. So they go before Solomon arguing and bickering over whose child is this. And of course, you could understand why one would make the argument for their child. But the king said, Solomon, the one says, this is my son, verse 23, that is alive, and your son is dead. And the other says, no, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. And the king said, bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king, and the king said, divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, O my Lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death. But the other said, he shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. Then the king answered and said, give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. And obviously it concludes with focusing on Solomon. But again, the mother who was willing to just give her child up to this other woman instead of having her child split in half or killed, because she was not going to die on that hill of saying, well, no, this is my child, and so whatever we have to do to prove that it's my child, well, she does what anyone else may think, well, that's not going to prove it's your child. But to Solomon, and with his in-depth wisdom, you can see for a woman to have that kind of love and care for a human life, clearly this is her child. And I think we can see nuances of that even in death with Rizpah here. The sanctity of life and dignity in death are still worthy pursuits regardless of societal norms. God puts such a precedent on human life. It is from God. We are made in His image. It is to be respected. It is to be honored because we are image bearers of Him. We are different than any other creation on the face of the earth because we have a soul. We are of spirit, unlike any other creature on the face of this planet. And for one to live and for one to die, it is to take recognition. Why do we read of so many patriarchs and their records of them dying, and for Joseph and having his bones carried from Egypt to the land of promise? Because there was still this respect, even in death, for the dignity of these people, and this mother was going to honor her children in making sure that they were not going to be destroyed as far as the remains of their body, as she takes that sackcloth in verse 10, spreads it for herself on the rock. All the while, you know she is grieving, she is heartbroken from the beginning of harvest until rain fell upon them from the heavens, and she did not allow the birds of the air to come upon them by day or the beasts of the field by night. And we need to recognize as well, as we said, being a mother is a thankless job oftentimes. She certainly wasn't doing this to get front page news or anything like that. And yet the word spreads to King David and it is preserved in the Holy Scriptures today about this woman Rizpah who did what most people may not have decided to do. I can't say, not being in that situation myself, but what love she shows for even the memory of her children to do this. And we see that when David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them on the day the Philistines killed Saul in Gilboa. And he brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who were hanged. And so along with Saul and Jonathan are these ones that Rizpah was protecting from the animals, and they are honored as well as far as having their remains collected and gathered. And so, again, when you think about it, is this for a reason? Is this what perhaps we see leads to God actually answering their cry? Because look then in verse 14. And they buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin and Zelah in the tomb of Kish his father. And they did all that the king commanded. And after that, God responded to the plea for the land. It's not until then that God answers the prayer. And I read it suggested, I can't say that this is with 100% certainty, but according to this one source, they say, although this execution is done in a way that implies Yahweh's endorsement, Yahweh himself never endorses this action. David and the Gibeonites draw their own conclusions about what Yahweh desires. It is not until the bodies are taken down and buried that God answers David's prayer to remove the famine from the land. This seems to imply that God is displeased with this action and that God's only wish was that David would reconcile with the Gibeonites. And so, as we'll see later on, sometimes we choose to take matters into our own hands without any further guidance, and sometimes it's the mother that we need to listen to. But here in this case, Rizpah shows love even in death for her children, and whether or not that is the basis for God finally responding to the plea to end the famine, that is for God to know and for us to ponder about. But I believe Rizpah is admirable in her actions to the point that David takes recognition and takes care of her family in gathering their remains and not leaving them out to be ravaged. And so, okay, that's the first one. It gets better from here, hopefully. Right? We're going to go now to Daniel, the book of Daniel, and look at our second overlooked mother, the mother of King Belshazzar. So overlooked, she doesn't even have a name, right? In Daniel chapter 5, we read of an instant where, and you've got quite a gap between Daniel chapter 4 and Daniel chapter 5. In Daniel chapter 4, you have Nebuchadnezzar giving his own testimony of having his honor restored to him and his kingdom restored to him. And then all of a sudden, chapter 5, you've got King Belshazzar, who is not Nebuchadnezzar's direct son, although we'll read in the text that he is referred to as his father. That just means ancestry. In his ancestry, he was a father. He was a precursor to him. And so this mother that we'll read of here is believed to be the mother of King Belshazzar. She could have been the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, but likely also the wife of Nabonidus, who was basically co-king with his son Belshazzar. I believe Nabonidus was elsewhere at the time while Belshazzar was reigning over Babylon. But nonetheless, you have this mother of King Belshazzar, and here's just a little bit more background on this time frame. You have Nebuchadnezzar, who reigned from 605 to 562. He was succeeded by his son Evil Merodach, also rendered Awel Marduk, who reigned from 562 to 560. He was assassinated by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar, who reigned from 562 to 560. Neriglissar was succeeded by his son, Labasi Marduk. He ruled for a short time and was replaced by Nabonidus, who remained in control until Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC, which is right around where we're going to conclude with this chapter. And so in Daniel chapter 5, we have a mother who is distanced from her foolish son. Look there in verse 1. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought. Let me reread that. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. Okay, so with all of that, you see Belshazzar and you think about maybe the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, even connecting him back to Nebuchadnezzar, and you have this heritage of wicked reigns in Babylon, but yet you have this queen in verse 10, or the queen mother as it would probably be more appropriately rendered, because you see there earlier in the text, Belshazzar has his wives and his concubines drinking with him. His mother was not there. She was not taking part in this raucous occasion. She was not taking part in this desecration of these golden vessels that had been taken from the house of God in Jerusalem. She was not participating. But when she learns that her son is troubled, that's when she shows up. This is only the first example of her wisdom, just in the fact that she did not take part in this occasion. You would think that she probably had the right to, being a royal herself, but she chooses to speak up when he is overcome with fear. She recognizes him as king. She calls him king and shows him honor and respect for his authority. But when your child is overcome with fear, no matter how old that child is, a mother always seems to remain a mother, no matter how old they've become and how old their children have become. And that seems to be the case here. Look there again now in verse 11. There is a man in your kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Okay, so she speaks up, and she knows her family history to the point of she knows the value of Daniel being brought in this situation. But my question would be, how many other opportunities did he have beforehand to learn from the past history of his ancestors, like Nebuchadnezzar? How could he not know about Daniel? In fact, fast forward to verse 22. Here you have Daniel brought in. Daniel's interpreting. And he says in verse 22, and you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. Daniel tells him things that he already knew, and yet he's saying, you knew this, and yet you're choosing to be a fool. You have lifted up yourself, verse 23, against the Lord of heaven. Though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. And just begs to question, had Belshazzar's mother tried to talk to him before about Daniel? Had she seen maybe this train going off the tracks before and tried to reason with him, but because things weren't off the rails, at least in his own mind and his own opinion of himself, maybe he had a little bit of that genetic code of Nebuchadnezzar and thinking he was just the greatest. And it's not until he was scared out of his wits that he would finally listen. I think it's completely plausible. He's finally listening. He's finally using someone who knows what they're talking about, who is of God, who's proven himself wise before, who has been tested himself, thrown in a den of lions, has been taken from home and serving in this kingdom that he never asked to be a part of. And yet he has remained faithful to God while Belshazzar has been living it up. And it's until he finally wakes up to his own foolishness and shown, you know better. You knew better. You know this stuff, and now here you are. And it's not a happy ending for Belshazzar, but it reminds me of Proverbs 1, verses 8 through 9, and just a side point for all of the children and those growing up still in the home, or even seeking guidance today, and maybe you've looked everywhere else but your parents. You're out of the home, and your life has been off the rails, or what have you. Proverbs 1, 8 and 9, Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck. There's value in our parents' words, in our mother's words. And although her solution didn't absolve him from his problem, she didn't know what God's judgment was going to be ahead of time. It was direction that he didn't have and perhaps never took before. Maybe this is the first time he's listened to Mama in a long time. His arrogance would seem to indicate as much. And it just begs the question, what might have been if he turned to the wisdom of Daniel and in connection to the Lord before it was too late? But in all of this, I believe that his mother is to be admired for having the wherewithal and the continued care and concern for her son to provide some kind of direction, some kind of understanding that there is an answer. There is a route you haven't taken yet. You need to exercise it. I think there's value in that. Third, one that perhaps we're a little bit more familiar of, but probably don't hear too much in regards to just mothers themselves, is the Canaanite, or also known as the Syrophoenician mother, in Matthew chapter 15 and Mark chapter 7. We're going to refer to both of these texts, and so if you want to keep your finger in both, that is a good idea. But in Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28, as we had read for us this morning, we have this Syrophoenician woman, and she is a socially rejected woman who seeks help from Jesus. Right? She is a Syrian of, I believe, the region of Phoenicia, as would indicate from the phrase. She's from Tyre and Sidon. And so, in other words, she is a Gentile, and she is indicated as much here and in Mark. And she would understand that she's not accepted by the Jews. She's unclean in their eyes. And so she's a socially rejected woman, and yet she's seeking the help of Jesus. Notice there in Mark chapter 7, verse 25, she comes to Jesus because she had heard of him. Immediately, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. And then she recognizes him as the son of David. You go back to Matthew chapter 15 and verse 22. And behold, the Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, Have mercy on me, O Lord, son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. It is here in Mark chapter 7 that we learn that she is a young daughter. She is little. And so you can only imagine, we hurt for our children no matter how old they are when they're suffering from any kind of malady or what have you. There's always something about a young child that pricks our hearts, especially even if it's not our own child. We see a story on Facebook of a child hooked up to tubes or whatever else. That hits us a little bit different. And here this little helpless daughter has an unclean spirit, and this woman is desperate for help. She's desperate to find an answer that she has not found yet, but she hears of Jesus. She recognizes him as the Messiah, as the Son of David, and yet, what's the response? She's ignored. This is one of those passages in the Gospels that we read of Jesus, and you're probably a little bit bothered. I thought Jesus was a loving Savior. I thought Jesus cared about all people. Does he not care about this woman? I mean, he refers to her as a dog. Was he insulting her? It could have been taken as an insult. And I appreciate Rob's translation. The better rendering of that text would be that she was referred to as a little dog, as though like a house pet. and not like the other Greek term for dogs that would refer to a wild animal, untamed. He was not referring to her to that, but one that would be in a house belonging to a master. And so you say, still not the most flattering of descriptions for this lady. But initially, she is ignored. He did not answer her a word. After hearing, my daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. After hearing, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. He ignores her. And then furthermore, his disciples want her to get sent out. He did not answer her word. His disciples came and begged him, saying, send her away, for she is crying out after us. She's annoying. We don't want to hear her. Right? We've got more important stuff to do than deal with this dirty Gentile. It's not our problem, right? Well, that was their attitude, but I would pose to you the disciples' motives were very different from Jesus, and it very well could be possible that he was trying to teach them a lesson through her. Because Jesus knows the hearts of all. He's God. He knew the heart of this woman, and he knew the hearts of his disciples. And they've already put it on full display as well as she had. And they just are dismissive of her. And it's not the only time that they were dismissive of people. But she was persistent. And she was persistent with humility and with faith. Jesus was keenly focused on Jews at this point. That is true. As we see in Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, when he sends out the 12, he tells them specifically, go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Okay? What are we to take from that? He didn't care about the Gentiles again? No, of course not. Jesus gives the slightest indication of hope to this woman, again, with this reference to a little dog, and she picks up on it. And she says, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Jesus was providing a sliver of hope that he knew was going to expand, especially once the crucifixion and resurrection transpired. Because then you go to Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. And what does Jesus tell his disciples? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. The crumbs have turned into the meat and potatoes, haven't they? Jesus wants his gospel message brought to all nations, including the nation of this woman, the place of this woman, and others like her who would hear the gospel. And certainly that's what we have the book of Acts for, and showing us how that all transpires. But she replied with more understanding than Jesus' own disciples, even though it seems as though she's just being dismissed. And why? Why can she do this? Because she had a solitary focus on, I need to help my daughter. I need to serve my daughter. She needs help. Jesus can help. There's nowhere else I can turn to. In Mark chapter 7 and verses 27 and 28, it gives the idea of the precedence given to the Israelites first. In that text, let the children be fed first, the children of Israel. For it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And that, again, she's quoted as saying, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. She found hope even in his statement. And just like these other two mothers that we've read of already, she's remembered forever as a mother of great faith. Look there in verse 28. Then Jesus answered her, O woman, great is your faith, be it done for you as you desire. And her daughter was healed instantly. The faith this woman had in a moment was the kind of faith that Jesus was trying to teach his disciples on a daily basis. In an instant, this woman showed faith in Christ that not many had shown him before. And then finally, another one that you've heard of, I know, but that's just one verse that we read of in 2 Timothy chapter 1 about Eunice as well as Lois. Of course, here Paul is writing to his understudy, his preacher trainee, if you will, Timothy, trying to prepare him, trying to encourage him. And what does he play on here? What does he refer back to? He refers to his childhood. You know, and this point I think can be made rather quickly with Eunice, because I only have one verse to go with anyway. But there are plenty of parents that leave inheritance for their children. And there might be children that are focused on that, of what's mom and dad going to leave for me once they're gone. But not everyone leaves a legacy worth following. But Eunice does. And Lois does. Paul's confidence in Timothy's faith was at least partially based on the faith of his mother and grandmother. Look there in the text. Verse 3, I thank God whom I serve, as did my ancestors, with a clear conscience, as I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. As I remember your tears, I long to see you, that I may be filled with joy. I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I'm sure dwells in you as well. For this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. Paul's confidence in Timothy's faith was at least partially based on the faith that he knew was instilled in him by his mother and grandmother. You just think about that. That was something worth noting by Paul to encourage him to fan into flame the gift of God, because I know you know this stuff. So you have Belshazzar on one hand. Daniel says, I know you know this stuff and you did nothing about it and you're going to be destroyed because of it. And yet Paul telling Timothy, I know you know God because of the faith of your mother and your grandmother. What a legacy to be remembered for that. What kind of faith? It was a sincere faith, Paul calls it. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I'm sure dwells in you as well. It's very likely that Timothy's father was not a Christian. He's not referred to. And yet you have these two women who are absolutely instrumental in the life of Timothy for him to be where he is at this point. This is a sincere faith. It's a multi-generational faith. It's like what we see in so many families among us that is so worthy of respect. For Timothy, it was a foundational and vital faith for him to then move forward with greater potential in his kingdom work. Again, 6 and 7, for this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God. Timothy had the foundation through his mother and grandmother, but now he needed to take the ball and run with it for himself. Fan into flame the gift of God. I think it's a simple point that we can make from all of this. What you model today can set the groundwork for kingdom work. When we think about motherhood and fatherhood and parenthood, a lot of times we get distracted by the minutia of the day-to-day, the rigmarole of life. I've got to get them here. I've got to get them there. They've got a school project done. We've got to make sure that we go to 15 practices this week and all these other things that chock full our schedule. And at the end of the day, really at the end of our life, what are we going to look back on? All the soccer and baseball games and science trophies and academic awards that our children acquired and how much money they've been able to get in their 401k because we raised them to be academically successful, but they're unfaithful to God. They don't know Jesus and they're going to die in their sins. So many people put a precedent on worldly success, and the only legacy they leave their children is the rat race of life without ever knowing Jesus. God forbid us ever have that kind of focus. What you do is so important as a parent. What you are teaching your children what you are doing this very moment and sitting in a pew, listening to a lesson. Have you ever thought about how bizarre this probably seems to the world? You're here listening to this ugly, bald-headed guy talking about some old book where things are written, and yet you see the value in it because of your faith that you're instilling into your children and showing them this is priority one. God is first. If you ride the bench because we couldn't get you to every practice because we were going to church first, I don't care. Because you were sitting in a more important seat on Sundays and Wednesdays. You were sitting in a more important seat in my home learning from me. That takes priority. And that was the faith that Timothy was able to go off of from his parents. And it can be done with or without a faithful husband. And it can be done without a pulpit, but not without a voice. Some of the greatest teaching in my life came from my mom. Lessons that I'll always remember, where she didn't have to say a word, but just by watching her, seeing how she responded to situations that were hard, taught me more than I've learned on my own or learned from a preacher, because I was with her every day. And yeah, she raced us to practices and all those things too. But what I will always remember is the love she had for God. And I hope that's what my children can see in my wife and in myself, and I hope that that's your desire for you. Not just so that you can be remembered, but that Jesus can be known for another generation, because this is kingdom work. The work you do in your home is kingdom work. It is building the future of the church. And so just quickly, just a recap. Remember, the protection of a mother is powerful even in sorrow and death, like Rizpah. Like the mother of Belshazzar, the wisdom and comfort of a mother is valuable, and we'd always do well to receive it. The love and faith of a mother pushes through boundaries and stigmas to do what's best for her child, like the Canaanite mother with Jesus, and answering with faith. And like Eunice, leaving a legacy of faith and love for the Lord is helping set up your child up for eternal success. And that is not a question. I don't know why that question mark is up there. The work you do for and with your children today is vital for the work of the church tomorrow. We get excited about bringing people in from the community, as well we should. But we cannot overlook or take for granted that someday maybe my kids will respond to the gospel. We have to put in the effort. We have to leave that legacy of faith with them by putting in the effort day in and day out, not getting distracted by all the other things that can pull us away. But remember, the legacy that has been left for us by someone else who led us to the gospel, we need to be those that lead our own children to the gospel. And so thanks be to God for all of these examples and more in His Word and in our lives of mothers that we can look up to, mothers that leave a legacy of faith and of trust and of hope in Jesus. And so, what about you today? Is the legacy you're going to leave for your children one of faith? Have you obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ by putting Him on in baptism and living your life as a committed disciple of His? It's not too late to start that legacy today, to be forgiven and to be faithful. But if you are a child of God and you realize you've not been living much like a child and you've been more orphaned in your faith because you've not been trusting Him, you've forgotten, like Belshazzar and others, of what we have in God that's unlike anyone else, come back. Come back to Him. Come back like that prodigal son, and He will receive you with open arms. Even now, while together we stand and while we sing.